All right. Dear all, a warm welcome to all colleagues and friends of the International Crisis Group, and welcome to all those who keep connecting as we talk to join this event. We sincerely appreciate that you are here with us today, unfortunately still in virtual presence only, taking the time to join us at an intense moment for the conflicts and crisis situations that we all work on. My name is Giuseppe Fama, and I'm the head of EU Affairs at Crisis Group. Before introducing this morning's event, for those who are not familiar with our work, please allow me to briefly tell you who we are. Crisis Group is an independent organization working to prevent wars and shape policies that can build sustained peace. Our mandate is to engage with all parties and support efforts to prevent, mitigate, and resolve violent and deadly conflict. We do so by sounding the alarm bell, providing independent, field-based, and high-quality analysis, and engaging directly with conflict actors and key international players, like many of you in this event are, to encourage informed and intelligent action for peace. And indeed, this is what we aim to do this morning as well, discussing what are the drivers of the rising tensions in the Eastern Mediterranean, what are the stakes at play, and how to strengthen peace prospects across the region. The whole Mediterranean has been one of the crucial junctions of humankind. Migration, trade, political and cultural exchanges made it one of the most prosperous areas through world history. Yet it has also been the crossroads of competing interests and of the ambitions of regional and global powers, including those not far from its own borders. Shows of naval power, security dilemmas of all kinds, threats, and outright wars have tormented the past of this region. We may say the same about the recent past and about the present too. The Eastern Mediterranean remains a vital junction for human and economic flows across Europe, Asia, and Africa. But the region is again the theater of several crises, very much intertwined among themselves, which compose a multi-layered and complex reality. Geopolitics continue to divide the island of Cyprus, which is an EU member state. The rivalry between Greece and Turkey has also made the area a dense spot for naval exercises and military buildups of all kinds. More and more migrants continue to attempt reaching Europe to escape hardship from Syria and other fragile contexts. And most recently, several discoveries of natural gas and the internationalization of the Libyan civil war are the new causes of friction. Along with internal political shifts, these developments prompted a new escalation between Turkey and its neighbours, particularly Greece and Cyprus, which reached dramatic peaks. Most notably in summer last year, when Greek and Cypriot and Turkish vessels came into close contact on two occasions. Although both sides held their positions, tensions decreased progressively, and Turkey and Greece have returned to talks, but the situation is very far from being on a stable track to resolve any of the layers building this complex crisis. The European Union, among all actors, is particularly confronted by the dilemma of how to balance incentives and disincentives, protecting the interest of its own member states, but also avoiding to alienate a necessary partner for the European Union, as it is Turkey. Let me use this privilege indeed of introducing our event to stress the exceptionality of the situation as seen from Brussels. The Greek-Turkish standoff combines the EU's internal dimension with questions around the soul-searching of its own foreign policy. It challenges the EU's energy strategy and brings into internal competition between national players too. It also raises competing views among EU member states on the EU's common foreign security policy, especially when we look at the implications this crisis has in other conflicts in the region, such as Libya. This is why this event is indeed part of a series of activities that we address primarily to the European Union and the European policy community. This crisis talk, as we call it, is part of an ongoing collaboration with the European Union that helps us strengthen the Union's conflict analysis, early warning capacity, and deliver them policy advice on how to intervene to prevent, mitigate, and possibly resolve violent conflict. And so I wish to acknowledge the partnership with the European Commission through the instrument contributing to stability and peace, and the very strong collaboration with the European External Action Service, which enables all of this work. Therefore, this crisis talk will devote particular attention to European actors, but also expand our view to other regional players and the United States too. As we continue convening in this virtual format, we can also benefit from the participation of many colleagues from the region and across Europe. A little less than 100 colleagues are joining the call for this debate, including policy practitioners, regional experts and diplomats working on peace and security from the EU and its member states, as well as colleagues from civil society, journalists, and international organizations elsewhere. Plenty more will be also watching this event live through our channels. And indeed, this event is on the record and live streamed via our website and our YouTube channel. For those joining via these platforms or social media, you can interact with questions and comments in the YouTube page, and we encourage you to animate the discussion also on Twitter and other social media using the hashtag crisis talks. This crisis talk will be structured in one single session, but we will make sure to integrate at least 3 dimensions. First of all, we will address different perspectives from Ankara and Athens. Secondly, we will look at the as a second pillar at the regional setting of this competition, particularly looking at the energy dimension. And a third pillar will address the EU and US roles and interests in the Eastern Mediterranean. And of course, we will devote about a third of our time to a Q&A with our participants, either in the school or in other platforms. I very much look forward to the panel discussion. I'm sure it will enrich not only our understanding, but also the array of options to consider in order to avoid a new escalation in the region. And now let me introduce you the colleague who will guide us through this exchange, Hugh Pope, who's Crisis Group's Director of Communication and Outreach. Hugh holds this position since 2015, leading the overall planning, organization, and direction of Crisis Group's communications to build up Crisis Group public face, impact, and support for conflict prevention. But there is more, because for 10 years before that, Hugh was Crisis Group Deputy Program Director for Europe and Central Asia, and most importantly, Crisis Group Project Director for Turkey and Cyprus, before other colleagues took over the role of being our leading minds, presence, and voices on this crisis. I sincerely hope that this exchange between our colleagues and guests will help strengthen our action in the crisis situations we will discuss today. And let me also thank all of you again who connected with us. I wish you all a very productive exchange. Dear Hugh, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Giuseppe, for the kind introduction, and it's great to be back with this topic, which is very dear to my heart after all those years we spent together on it. And as Giuseppe mentioned, we're going to do this in 3 parts with the excellent speakers just waiting to join us. I will say just one extra thing about the format of the talk is that we will have something called a Slido system for putting your questions. You'll see it on the YouTube channel. You can vote. Vote your questions up, the ones that you want to see, and we will then put them to the panelists when they finish their presentations. As Giuseppe mentioned, we're going to do this in 3 phases. The first looking at Athens and Ankara and Turkey, Greece. The second looking at the more regional context, and the third looking at the actual hydrocarbon aspect of it. And here we're very lucky to be joined by Charles Elinas from the Republic of Cyprus. And that will come at the end. So without further ado, let's go to the first stage of our panel today. We're going to talk to Berkay Mandirici, our analyst for Turkey, who joined us in 2015 in our office in Istanbul. He comes from an NGO background in Turkey, and for us has also covered things like the conflict in Turkey's southeast with the Kurdistan Workers' Party, and also the return of ISIS. And so luckily the East Mediterranean issues are much less dangerous currently. But I think I'll start by putting the same question to both our panelists for this session, which include Yanis Grigoriadis, who I'll introduce in a minute. But Berkay, first to you. We saw some really grave tensions in 2019 and 2020, some of the worst we'd seen for many decades, actually, with Ankara sending seismic ships into waters contested not just with Greece and the Republic, but also the Republic of Cyprus, and delineating maritime boundaries far further than ever before. Since the beginning of this year, we've seen talks start between Ankara and Athens. We've seen a more conciliatory approach, apparently, from Ankara. Just tell us, what do you think the risks are should these talks break down again?
Thank you very much, Hugh. And thank you also for the question. So, I mean, we have been looking at the sort of East Med issues from the Libya prism. We did this in 2020, We moved on to write this report on Turkey, Greece, as you said, which I will go into more detail during my speech. Our Middle East colleagues are also looking into sort of the regional energy dimension. And we are also now working on a report on Cyprus, on the Cyprus dispute, which is also going to be on our agenda. So a lot of new outputs in the pipeline from our side. But so much for self-promotion. I think Giuseppe already covered that quite well. What I want to do to answer your question is to look at sort of the interrelated dynamics behind, Ankara's turn towards a more muscular approach in 2020. What were the reasons behind that? And what is the rationale behind sort of the recent turn towards de-escalation and sort of mending ties with adversaries? And finally, sort of also go a bit into the recommendations we have on Turkey, Greece, and also maybe conclude with a few points on Cyprus. So first, how did we get here? I think there are a number of interrelated reasons. First of all, hydrocarbon resources that were found in 2011 that picked up in 2018-19, and a sense of exclusion of Turkey and Turkish Cypriots from these energy designs led to a major concern and major frustration on part of Ankara. And it rendered it more urgent for Turkey to do something to respond to this isolation that it was perceiving. Of course, the non-resolution of the Cyprus dispute and grievances that have built up around the fact that Cyprus has remained unresolved for so many years, despite the 2004 Annan Plan and Turkish Cypriot support and Greek Cypriot Cypriots voting against the Annan Plan at the time, sort of starting the history from there has been something that we have been hearing a lot from Turkish officials as one of the main grievances that have been built up around Cyprus. And of course, all of this came at a time when Turkey's relations with the EU and the US became much more sour. And I think these are sort of the contextual reasons that we also need to keep in mind. Its relations with other countries that have a stake in the East Med also deteriorated, particularly following the Arab Spring. Turkey's backing of Muslim Brotherhood and affiliates, it strained and actually ruptured ties with Egypt. Relations became much more difficult with Israel. And Greece was really able to stack up support from these countries, capitalizing on Turkey's deteriorating ties with them. So essentially, from Turkey's perspective, there were two blocks of countries converged against it in the East Med scene, which prompted it to respond in the way that it did. And then there were also shifts in domestic politics in Turkey, quite significant shifts actually. The coup attempt in July 2016 in Turkey was an important turning point. Nationalists, both aligned with the president and opposed to him, were pushing for a more hardline stance, and also the foreign policy realm. And they blamed the government for what they saw as Turkey's foreign policy failures, saying these were a result of two compromising policy positions that did not serve Turkey's interests, be it towards the EU, be it on Cyprus, also normalization attempts with Armenia, all of which came to naught. And of course, this came at a time when sort of the president of the ruling party started losing some support in opinion polls. And there was an attempt to keep fragile alliances with nationalists, with the Nationalist Party actually afloat, both in the bureaucracy and the parliament. So in a sense, there was a convergence of interest between the nationalist forces in Turkey and the ruling party, which reflected on foreign policy choices. So what we have seen, sort of the dominant narrative in Turkish politics for a while now, has been that there is an orchestrated attempt to contain Turkey's geostrategic reach, and that Turkey needs to push back against such efforts, including, if needed, via military means. And this line also gets a lot of buy-in from segments that do not support the ruling party. So there's a wide spectrum of support for such policy positions. So in a sense, we've seen sort of this Turkey's projection of hard power in an attempt to raise the stakes and sort of also to increase the cost for other states that it feels are ganging up against it and trying to strengthen its hand in prospective or existing negotiation tables, be it in Turkey, Greece, Cyprus, bilateral relations. And there were a number of ways in which Turkey responded to this. There was the maritime delimitation agreement that it struck with Libya in 2019. The main reason for that was to sort of respond to sort of the contest maximalist Greek claims. in the stretch of the East Med you can see on the map. Thank you for projecting that. There was also an intention to complicate efforts to sort of build an East Med gas pipeline that would run from the East Med sort of through the areas delimited between Turkey and Libya and onto Europe. And then, as you already said, Hugh, there were all these attempts about seismic research vessels being sent to Cypriot claimed and Greece claimed waters 2019-20 when tensions were rising. And of course, one thing we also should keep in mind is there was also at the same time, we saw that Turkey and Turkish Cypriots increasingly started voicing their preference for a two-state solution on Cyprus, calling for a solution that should be based on, equal sovereignty rather than a bizonal, bicommunal federation formula. We can discuss in how far that is realistic or not. But it was part of the response that Turkey and in sync with the new Turkish Cypriot leadership were giving to the sense of isolation from East Med affairs or East Med energy designs. And then finally we had a softening of tone. There was a pivot of Ankara towards intense diplomacy on the Turkey-Greece track, but also on Cyprus, informal talks, and also other attempts sort of to mend ties with Gulf countries, but also with Egypt, to sort of peel off, as we say in our report, support that Greece and Cyprus are getting from these countries and for other interest-related reasons. So how to explain this pivot towards the West and other adversaries? I think on the Turkey-Greece track, Ankara saw that it could not afford more brinkmanship due to its economic fragility. Turkey really needs to mend ties with the West for, not least for investor confidence. There was a threat of EU sanctions, which probably also played a role, and it could have been sort of could have affected the economy even more. Also, in some ways, some of Turkey's adversaries began throwing their support behind Greece and the Republic of Cyprus even more than they did before, when tensions were high. So, Greek diplomacy in sort of galvanizing the EU and especially France and other countries who support it also showed that there were some limits of this assertive policy approach. And then, there was a realization that, there was not much more Turkey could gain from showing military muscle, and hence the push for relaunching talks with Greece. I think that was sort of the rationale behind Ankara and sort of going back to talks. The international context has also been shifting, which I think also played a role, and Alisa will talk about that more. But I just wanted to mention that, Turkey is trying to profile itself more sort of as a geostrategically useful country for the West and also within NATO. We saw this recently in discussions around Afghanistan, Turkey's role in potentially securing the Kabul airport. To some extent also, when tensions rose with Ukraine. So there's sort of and there's a normalization process, of course, ongoing between Gulf countries, Israel, Iran, and Turkey is concerned about being an outlier in the region or being excluded from these new regional emergent designs, which also sort of pushes Ankara and the Ankara leadership more towards diplomacy and diplomatic, like investing in diplomacy right now. But that, that does not really mean that Ankara is ready for substantive compromises at the moment. Any sort of concessions, especially on maritime sovereignty claims, are very unpopular right now, and probably it's similar in Greece. I'm sure Ioannis will talk about that more. But opposition parties vying for national support are even pushing for a harsher stance on some of these files. And we are approaching 2023 election cycle in 2023. Where the key voters will be nationalists, and the opposition parties will be vying for that as well. So there is really very little room, and even maybe not any room for significant concessions, compromises at the moment. But still, we believe it's important to capitalize on both sides' willingness to talk, Turkey's and Greece's willingness to talk, and strengthening dialogue channels. One helpful step that we identified in the report is to sort of a recommitment to CBMs that have been elaborated in the past. We are still seeing NAVTEX announcements every now and then by both sides. Military drills are ongoing in the Aegean Sea. We also recently saw tensions between the two countries' coast guards. Migration is becoming a tense issue, remains a tense issue, both at the land border, but also in the Aegean Sea. around alleged pushbacks, etc. So it would be important for the sides to sort of recommit to military CBMs and where needed, expand them. Of course, there is a channel that is sort of the Turkey-Greece military talks on CBMs have been revitalized recently. So hopefully they can lead to some concrete outcomes soon, because it's important for those CBMs are important because they can reduce the risk of accidents turning into bigger escalation. And we've seen in the history of the Aegean dispute that this has been the case in the past. And then the two other aspects, the sort of addressing Turkey's sense of isolation. We've sort of looked into that as well. And I guess, in the end, sort of overcoming opposition of members of the East Med Gas Forum to sort of Turkey's inclusion would be an important step. Of course, there's still some way to go in that direction. And whether this will actually move forward will also depend on whether Turkey can normalize ties with Egypt, Israel, France in particular. But that's an area sort of to address this isolation that Turkey and Turkish Cypriots are expressing. And on the EU dimension, I think that's I wanted to note that as well. The positive agenda that we have on the table, sort of modernizing the customs union, new funds for Syrian refugees, which will be coming. These are all very important agenda items for Ankara from a Turkish perspective. But I mean, of course, the money that will come in for refugees is also very critical for the well-being of millions of refugees Turkey is generously hosting. And their vulnerability has increased during the pandemic. So that's definitely important. And I think these areas, both the customs union modernization and cooperation with refugees, are all positive in terms of potentially in the future opening up channels for more cooperation between Turkey and EU when things are more conducive. And finally, on Cyprus, there are we've started looking into the Cyprus question more deeply recently. But I think there are two sort of areas to look out for. Whether any common ground emerges between Greek and Turkish Cypriots to move from the 5+1 informal talks to formal negotiations. The sides still seem quite far apart as it stands. And sort of a breakdown of these contacts, of course, could be a trigger for more tensions. And I think sort of UN efforts in this regard should be watched, and there will probably be more meetings in September coming up. And then I think there's also this question on Cyprus, especially, what can be done irrespective of a path to settlement? What can we do while the sides are searching for common ground? And this will also depend on whether there's, a willingness emerging on the Greek and Turkish Cypriot side to agree to progress on sort of negotiations to stabilize sort of the island and the situation in the East Med, especially, on issues such as Varosha, gas revenue sharing, steps to ease the isolation of the North. But I mean, these are sort of steps that can be explored that could bring some positive momentum into the Cyprus discussion. But I would be curious to hear more views on this from the panelists and the audience. Maybe I'll leave it at that. And I already look forward to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Berkay. That was seeing a relatively benign answer to the risks. I'm very interested to see what our next speaker will have to say. Yanis Grigoriadis comes from a glittering array of academic and research institutions in Columbia, in Oxford and Berlin, but he's best known to all of us for being able to straddle the Aegean Sea. He has bases in both Turkey and Greece and is respected and admired on both sides, which is a very rare achievement, and is currently holding the Jean Monnet Chair of European Studies in a Turkish university, Bill Kent University, and is also a research fellow in Athens at Eliamet. Yanis, welcome to our panel. You heard Berkay give a fairly a description of the fragilities, but on the whole, seeing a benign course for at least the short term. Do you think that the risks are great of the talks breaking down and us going back to the tensions we saw in 2019, 2020, or would you join Berkay in saying that mostly things seem to be set fair?
Thank you very much, Hugh, for the very generous introduction. Thanks to the International Crisis Group for having me here this morning. I would join this slight optimism in the sense that I think that the latest meeting of the two leaders went well. So the meeting of Mitsotakis and Erdogan in Brussels in the context of the NATO summit went better than expected by many experts. And I think that this healed one of the most important issues in the context of deteriorating relations of the two countries over the last 2 years, which was the lack of a personal relationship, a good personal relationship and the channel of communication between the two leaderships. I think that this hurt a lot the relationship at the time when things were going bad. There was no way to stop them from becoming worse. And there have been a lot of issues that really hurt the bilateral relationships over the last 2 years. And as you said in the beginning, it hasn't been as bad for decades since the Helsinki, December 1999 Helsinki decision that named Turkey as a candidate state. We've seen the crisis in the Eastern Mediterranean in last summer, but we've also seen the refugee crisis on the Greek-Turkish border, which was another very important event, which was interpreted in Greece by many Greeks as a hybrid attack by Turkey against Greek sovereignty, because it really stressed the Greek government position and also sort of raised a lot of concerns about the nature of the relationship between the two countries. And of course, as Berkay mentioned, this signature of the Libyan Turkey memorandum back in November of 2019, if I remember well, this agreement also opened the Pandora's box regarding the maritime disputes between the two countries. This was an issue that was shelved for many, many years. The two sides had agreed to disagree, but no side took action in putting its position forward against the other. So by taking this position, Turkey moved the dispute back into the mid-90s, like when the EMIA-Karda crisis took place, when the two countries would dispute sovereignty and sovereignty rights over maritime zones. And I would like to make this interesting connection because I think that there is something that we can tell this, we can figure out of this. The people who were influential back then in the mid-90s, these admirals and these military officers that were behind the drive of Turkey's putting a number of multilateralist claims against Greece and against international law of the sea or the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, were the same people that were advising the Turkish government in the last few years. And I refer to the authors of the so-called Blue Homeland Doctrine that became again relevant for Turkish foreign policy as a result of a number of developments in Turkey and the failed coup attempt and the recovery and of some of the officers that were removed by the Erdogan government in the first years of its administration. And they joined again the government alliance under the circumstances, of course, of the post-2015 Turkish coalition government, which is the AK Party and MHP, with the AK Party taking a very different attitude on foreign and security policy issues compared to the past. What was the irony of the situation was that Erdogan used to be criticized, and Berkay said, I think put it correctly, that many of the opposition seem to agree with what the Turkish government has been doing over the last years, because they used to accuse Erdogan for being too soft on Greece, or on the Greek-Turkish disputes, or on Cyprus. And now that the Turkish government shifted to that position, they appear to be arguing that the Turkish government came to our position or to our national position. Of course, this was matched with a much more unilateralist and militaristic attitude of Turkey. Turkey intervened in Syria, intervened in Libya, and attempted to project itself as a power that is not bound by its Western political and military alliances. And this, of course, was a very alarming issue for many neighbors in the region, including the countries that eventually came closer to Greece. So in that respect, Greece's success in signing an exclusive economic zone agreement with Italy first and Egypt, most importantly, second, had to do with the fact that Turkey had become enormously isolated in the region. And this is independent of what Greece did. So Turkey was isolated for its own policy reasons and failures, maybe, in the region. And then the Greek government was simply able to reap the benefit of this and was able to sign an agreement with Egypt that, on the one hand, came closer to the Greek position. But on the other hand, if you look into the map, and Berkay's map highlighted this, Greece was willing to agree on a line that didn't agree on the principle of equidistance between Crete and the Egyptian coast. It wasn't 50-50%, it was slightly tilted towards the Greek side. So the Greek government showed flexibility in that respect, and this was understood by the international community. At the time, Turkey was making the most maximalist of all claims, i.e. arguing that it shares a common maritime border with Libya. So in that respect, I think the Greek position became stronger diplomatically internationally, and Greece was able to benefit from the stronger support of France and a number of other international actors that highlighted that what Turkey was doing in the Eastern Mediterranean was really undermining regional security. And of course, there was an instrument on the table to de-escalate and reduce tension, which was the resumption of exploratory talks that was taking place for many, many years between the two sides. The exploratory talks was a part of the Helsinki structure. The Helsinki decision of December 1999 had introduced a mechanism that would hopefully lead to the resolution of the Cyprus question by 2004. Unfortunately, it didn't happen, as we know, but also tried to frame the maritime dispute between Greece and Turkey in a way that there are some exploratory talks between the two sides, and in the case that these talks fail, then the two sides agreed to refer the case to the International Court of Justice, which would make a decision binding for both sides. So again, this opportunity was lost in 2004. Exploratory talks continued for some years. They were interrupted again, interestingly, in 2016. And then since then, the two countries had no channel of communication. And there was no diplomatic way to exchange views and prevent the escalation of tensions and disputes. So like issuing naftexes, for example, or making all sorts of unilateral moves. So this is how we came to this extremely dangerous situation of last summer, which I don't think was due to what the Greek government was intending. The Greek government was definitely not intending into getting into this, but it had to respond because what Turkey appeared to be doing was like sovereignty claims on an area that was also disputed, claimed by Greece. So the Greek government appeared compelled to make some moves there to claim that we have rights here and this is our sovereignty. We have sovereignty rights in this region as well. I would like also to conclude my brief statement. I don't want to take more time so we can have more discussion by referring to the Cyprus question. The Cyprus question has been poisoning developments in Greek-Turkish relations and in the Eastern Mediterranean overall. I think that the missed opportunity Crans-Montana, whereby until Crans-Montana, somebody could hope that natural gas discoveries could become a conflict resolution catalyst in the Eastern Mediterranean, because natural gas would provide some additional funds, because the solution of the Cyprus problem would cost money, and nobody would like to foot the bill. And if there was a natural gas bounty, that would be very, very good. Unfortunately, the Cyprus problem swallowed the natural gas discovery. So the natural gas discoveries amplified the disputes, because now we had the issue of Turkish-Cypriot representation, or the fact that Turkey doesn't recognize the Republic of Cyprus unlike the rest of the world. And all this adds to a complexity of a problem already complex and unsolved for many, many years. So in that respect, my understanding was that the Turkish government attributed at least some of the responsibility for the failure of the Cyprus talks to the Greek government. So in that respect, they didn't understand, maybe projecting the relationship between Turkish Cypriots and Turkey on the relationship between the Republic of Cyprus and Greece. They consider that the Greek government is equally responsible for the failure, at least from the Ankara point of view, of the peace talks in Crans-Montana. So they moved into a more unilateralist attitude and a more maximalist or aggressive attitude, this time infringing upon Greek rights, so not Cypriot rights. And this is how we came to this situation. So in that respect, any international attempt to revive the peace talks in Cyprus along the internationally recognized framework would be more than welcome. I recognize very much what Berkay said, that there is a new government in the north that has been taking now the by two-state solution as the priority, and that's of course another discussion topic. We cannot solve it now. I don't think it would be a viable solution, even though BBF, Bilateral Balkan Federation, might be a difficult solution to achieve. A two-state solution may have a lot of other issues to address before becoming a reality. So I wouldn't support that. But there are some issues to work on. For example, all this news about upcoming Varosha developments that is going to really poison the relationship, opening the Varosha ghost city to development, or sort of destroying the existing derelict properties of Greek Cyprus in order to build all sorts of hotel projects or, I don't know, other new housing projects in this area is going to really make conflict resolution in Cyprus even more difficult than it is today. So I would like to call for some action in that respect so that we don't get worse in Cyprus, and at least we can maintain the already difficult ground we have. Thank you.
Thanks, Yanis. Thanks for keeping to time too. That there are lots of issues that you've raised that I look forward to coming back to in the questions. This whole issue of Turkey's blue homeland policy, whether these personal relationships that you mentioned are really managing to restore proper communications, and of course also the issue that you refer to, that Cyprus before 2000, say, used to be a fairly niche interest. It was basically Athens, Nicosia, and Ankara, and ever since Cyprus joined the EU, it became an EU problem with Turkey on the outside, sort of Turkey negotiating to join, so half in but half out. And the circle of interest growing with or accelerated perhaps by the hydrocarbon issues of bringing in the East Mediterranean. And so with that, I think I'll move to the next phase of our discussion. And here I'll bring in Alyssa de Carbonell, who is Crisis Group's Deputy Program Director for Europe and Central Asia, but is thoroughly familiar with all these issues of Europe's security as a reporter who covered Europe's security for Reuters News Agency for many years, and has also been on the front lines of many active wars as a reporter before then. Alyssa, you've heard how this dispute over Cyprus and then the hydrocarbons and then the Aegean has kind of expanded to bring in other players. Can you just give us an overview of how the geopolitics of the situation is affecting the situation, and whether you would agree that, as Yanis and Berkay have so far laid out, that there is a slight reason for hope that the short term, at least, is less risky than it was a couple of years ago?
Yeah, thanks, Hugh. So I do think that's a good question. We've heard a lot already. So but I think maybe it wasn't the worst crisis of the last 50 years, in this periodic escalation between Turkey and Greece, but it was certainly the most protracted crisis to date. And I think a lot of that has to do with the geopolitical shifts since then. I mean, we've heard a bit from Berkay and Yanis definitely about, more in the detail about how this bilateral dispute has kind of morphed over time to encompass this wider knot of issues, and how the positions of the two make it even tougher to untangle right now with some of the domestic politics that Berkay and Yanis were talking about in Turkey also. But I mean, I do think there is, limited opportunity now for a more stable de-escalation, let's put it that way, not to resolve the problems per se, but to kind of move more, as we put it in the report, from brinkmanship to dialogue. And thankfully we are a long way off from where we were last summer, thanks to the summits last month and this decision to have direct contact between Mitsotakis and Erdogan to deal with these issues. So I think, the first thing was already mentioned on is Turkey's more assertive foreign policy and the reaction to it. The fact that it's become more increasingly isolated and that has pushed sort of rivals to back Greece more openly. I think this domino effect that Yanis spoke about of the Turkey-Libya agreement leading to partial agreements or ways to move forward with Italy, Egypt, and Albania on Greece's disputes there, maritime disputes there is significant, and also on the military front. Obviously, Greece has ramped up its exercises with allies as a deterrent. So, we see this ongoing despite the de-escalation, and just last week, from the other side of things, we had news that 30 Qatari fighter jets are going to be conducting training exercises in Turkey, which is kind of, can be seen as a response, but I'd be interested in other people's views on this, to the Greek Air Force's purchase of French fighter jets and military cooperation with the likes of Israel, UAE, Saudi Arabia. So I do think there is hope for optimism nevertheless, because the Mitsotakis administration has other priorities, and there is this diplomatic effort by Turkey to break its isolation. Again, I mean, at least from the EU perspective, there's a lot of skepticism there about whether this is a sustainable de-escalation, and whether Turkey won't just send out drill ships again. So I think, we can get into that a little bit more in the discussion, but in the big picture, the other issue, which of course we're going to go more into depth on in the next sort of presentations, is gas. And I think, the dispute isn't per se about gas, but obviously those discoveries aggravated tensions. But I think what's worth noting there is, that the idea, which has been very much supported by the EU and the US, that forums like the East Med Gas Forum could be a vehicle towards cooperation in a region, and that gas and economic cooperation could lead to at least a reduction of tensions, and better bilateral, multilateral cooperation in the region. But at least from Turkey's perspective, this, the MGF has sort of turned from an energy forum to a loose security framework that, really overlaps with other Middle Eastern disputes. And France has just joined now, but also, other excluded actors like Lebanon, don't see this forum as a kind of a purely economic gas cooperation forum any longer. But, there's also some hopeful lines there to stay in the more positive, optimistic aspect of things. I do think that Turkey's discovery of more gas in the Black Sea should provide some relief to the Turkish economy. It should go some way to easing sort of desires for energy independence. There's already been a reduction in dependence on Russian gas in Turkey in recent months and years. And these developments also coincide with pretty radical shifts in the energy market, which I'm sure Charles Elianes will speak a bit more about. But turning to international actors and institutions, many of the officials and diplomats that we spoke to for our latest report felt that sort of the ebb of US engagement in the region was a factor in last year's escalation. I think that's up for debate, but certainly the US has strengthened its relationship with Greece in a number of dimensions in recent years. And this is driven, including by the desire to sort of pry loose Russia's energy grips from the Balkans and other factors that don't really have to do with this dispute. But in any case, it's clear that Turkey's repositioning itself with respect to the US since Biden came into office. And that means including in the East Med. But this is by far not the most important bilateral issue for both, but these are helpful developments in this context. And then just to touch on some of the other actors from a European angle, well, NATO has obviously been an important mediator in the past, and Berkay spoke about some of the confidence building measures, military to military sort of the framework that has been put in place to for the militaries on both sides to exercise restraint, and that was brokered in large part by NATO in the past after previous cycles of escalation. They haven't played such a critical role at the moment. There was a very important sort of moment in the fall when NATO did encourage these efforts. But I think it's important to remember that Turkey remains an active and critical partner in NATO operations. You see that with the F-16 fighter jets just sent to Poland, to think about sort of the wider sort of picture of these things. And obviously at the NATO summit last month, we saw the importance of these kind of meetings on the sideline that have allowed for a reduction of tension, that have allowed for dialogue to go forward. And again, this direct channel of communication rather than what we saw. So, sort of last but not least in the geopolitics, I mean, Berkay again touched on this. Ankara's sort of dim prospects for EU accession, or dimming prospects for EU accession, has removed, one of the moderating factors in Turkish and Greek policy alike. But I think, it's also where we stand now. We kind of see an EU approach that teeters between extremes. It's, the signaling of the potential for interest-based cooperation, but also, threatening sanctions and restrictive measures. And the tensions over migration since 2016 have had a big influence on the EU's response to Turkey over other issues. Turkey is no longer as satisfied, perhaps, as it was at the time when the 2016 migrant deal was brokered, and both sides saw that as sort of relatively fair. Turkey has been less satisfied with that deal over time. There's questions over disbursement of funds and whatnot. But, Ioannis mentioned how important the migrant crisis was in Greece's thinking and reaction to this. And now, when you talk about EU policy, I guess the cynical view from Athens and Cyprus is that each EU member state has its own sort of interest driving its response to Turkish ships plying waters near Greece or Cyprus. And it has little to do with solidarity. In any case, we can see that German efforts to mediate last summer were kind of hamstrung by these EU divisions over the right approach to Turkey. But there are other tensions there, if we're quite honest. Germany was in a very good position to mediate at the time and has sort of important bilateral relationships with both actors. But things like the sale of German subs to Turkey and other issues are sort of a strain in the Greek Berlin relationship, though I'd be interested in Ioannis's and other people's thoughts on this. I mean, France has obviously taken the most unambiguous line in support of Greece. Rome has been hedging between Turkey and the EMGF bloc. Britain's absence has also sort of shifted the EU internal dynamics. And then there's this wider fragmentation that we kind of discussed a little bit of the EU's eastern and southern neighborhoods. On the one hand, the Baltic and Eastern states who are much more concerned about Russia, and you see that also in Poland's purchase of Turkish drones, which was the first sort of a NATO member state to do so, and on the other hand, sort of southern states that are more concerned about Libyan migration. But I mean, to strike a more hopeful note, I think French, Italian, German positions have more recently converged around the approach to Turkey. At least we've seen a consistent approach in the last EU councils with kind of this very careful language. So I don't know, I've raised a bunch of issues, but that's the sort of the wider context of actors looking at this situation from abroad and the things that factor in. So maybe I'll stop there.
Thank you, Alyssa. You've managed to summarize an immensely complicated situation extremely clearly. Thank you. It's always difficult to know what to recommend when there are so many small policies that need to be somehow corralled like sheep towards a goal. But we'll look forward to asking you more questions about that in a moment. And for our next stage of the discussion, we have two panelists who can deepen our knowledge in two directions. One, the first I'm going to turn to is Charles Elinas, but we will also be turning to Riccardo Fabiani, who will possibly give us a bit more both on the energy and the North African dimension. So Charles Elinas is well known to all of us for when the offshore gas issue burst onto the Turkey-Greece stage, and he is now a non-resident senior fellow with Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center. But back in 2011, he was the CEO of the Republic of Cyprus's Cypriot National Hydrocarbon Company, and he was an extraordinarily eloquent supporter of the dream that the gas then represented for Cyprus. It was those were heady days, which I'd be interested to hear your reflections on, but obviously tempered by 35 years of experience in the oil and gas sector. So, Charles, tell us. Is it, you know, you've seen all the ambitions that Cyprus had, and I guess slightly less than they were, and Ankara also still talking about becoming an energy hub. How real is all this energy? I mean, we've heard about how the prospect of all these riches has driven so much of the tensions and the ambitions of the various players. But is it real, and where do you see it going?
Thanks, thanks, Hugh. The answer is simple. It's surreal. We have gone away from reality into dreams and perceptions. I mean, Cyprus had an opportunity back in 2012 or 13 to take the gas situation further. That has gone. Didn't take it. It's gone. And it's a bit like what was said earlier on by Onis about the solution to the Cyprus problem. Opportunities come, they are missed, and they never come back again. And this is a problem. And Turkey's aspiration to become an energy hub is a dream as well. I mean, with Europe's shift to green energy and away from natural gas, the idea that Turkey could become an energy hub for Europe was never credible, and has since been overtaken by events. Turkey is a gas transit country, but not a hub. Not, for example, as TTF is in the Netherlands, and with Potash being a monopoly, it cannot become a hub. So let's skip that aside and go into the realities. In order to understand the future of natural gas resources in the East Med, we must first understand the fate of gas and gas prices globally, because often our friends and colleagues in the region concentrate on the region, lose sight of what is happening in the world. And gas is not a local commodity, it's a global commodity, and whatever happens in the East Med is dictated by developments elsewhere. Most major economies have committed to net zero by 2050. This leads to an inevitable shift towards clean energy at the expense of fossil fuels. And it's happening, and it's happening fast, and it's not going to be stopped. The EU is at the forefront of this shift through its Green Deal and its commitment to achieve a 55% cut in emissions by 2030, on the way to net zero emissions by 2050. And as you can see from the graph, according to the European Commission, this requires unabated gas consumption to decline by about a third by 2030 and become marginal by 2050. So how is the EU going to need more gas? And how is the EU going to encourage the East Med to produce more gas? It doesn't need it. This is supported also by the International Energy Agency, that in its roadmap to net zero by 2050, published in May, is calling time on the fossil fuel industry. It's calling for a stop to new oil and gas exploration by mid-2020s, if the world is to achieve net zero by 2050. According to the IEA, LNG exports, next slide, please, will peak this decade and decline thereafter. And you can see there what IEA is envisaging. I don't believe that it's going to happen in the same way, but something like that is bound to happen. LNG exports will peak and then will come down. That will challenge East Med's expectations to export its gas to Asia as LNG. If LNG demand is going to start coming down sometime this decade, or maybe even early the next decade, how can that justify developing East Med gas as LNG for exports to Asia? A gas project needs 5 to 7 years to develop, and it also needs 20 years life to recoup the investment. So we're talking about these projects being alive and exporting at full capacity well into the 40s. How is that going to happen with this potential reduction in demand? It's not feasible. In Europe, gas is facing an existential crisis as a result of new climate policies that are now affecting investment in new natural gas projects and plants. The world's largest banks and investment institutions are committing to a low carbon future. It is fast becoming a case of not just peak oil, but also peak oil investment, peak oil and gas investment. Where is the investment going to come from to sustain these projects? The IOCs, the international oil companies, are now being forced to adjust and operate in this new highly challenging environment. It creates a huge problem for all the international oil companies and financing of new projects. Listed oil company capital expenditure, as you can see from the graph, was about 360 billion in 2014. It came down to 200 billion in 2019, and it is now down to 140 billion and going even lower. This cannot sustain project activity to pre-COVID-19 levels. The trend for IOCs will be contraction to core regions and larger projects with less appetite to take new areas. This brings challenges to the development of the EastMed. Not only EastMed gas is expensive to develop and get to global markets, but the recent regional turmoil is caused by a belligerent Turkey, the Libyan instability, and the lingering maritime disputes and the Israel-Lebanon dispute and so on, may be becoming too challenging for the troubled IOCs to tackle. They have other areas to concentrate. Take ExxonMobil, has huge discoveries of oil, about 10 billion barrels in Guyana, much easier to develop. Why should they be bothering about the EastMed? As operations, exploration and production in the EastMed are led by the IOCs, and we depend on these. We don't depend on national oil companies. We don't have them. We depend on the IOCs. These developments are bound to affect future investments and plans substantially in the EastMed. The region needs to wake up to this fast evolving situation and adjust accordingly, but I'm afraid that is not happening. Apart from the fast shifting situation, gas is not the main driver of Turkey's actions in the EastMed, but the pretext. And let me explain. The geological likelihood of finding hydrocarbons in the areas of the EastMed Turkey has been exploring or drilling is small. So far, it has drilled 8 wells without any credible results. And it's not going to have any credible results. In addition, Turkey, driven by energy security concerns and balance of payments, has been prioritizing domestic energy production, renewables, hydro, coal, and now nuclear, and is now going to develop its own gas in the Black Sea at the expense of energy imports. So Turkey increased domestic energy production to 30% of the total energy it uses. And it has now diversified gas imports by bringing in floating storage and regasification units that allow it to import LNG from the spot market, buying from where it's possible. Last year, 20% of Turkey's gas came through these FSRUs. That's diversification. This gives credence to the view that Turkey's aggressive actions in the EastMed over the last few years are not energy-driven, particularly in the areas it claims to be part of its continental shelf, having such low probability of gas presence. The drivers behind these actions are geopolitical, pursuit of maritime control, and probably hegemony in the EastMed. But I leave it to other colleagues who concentrate on geopolitics to explain that. Last year, it appeared that President Erdogan preferred to maintain disputes as a distraction to divert internal opinion in Turkey from the increasing problems within the country due to its worsening economy. But the economic situation has now become dismal. mostly as a result of his own actions. His belligerence may have been tempered by the realization that he needs the EU and the US on his side. Confrontation is going to help him. After all, the EU is Turkey's main commercial partner, and the US is likely to take a dim view if the confrontations of 2020 are repeated. This time round, the new US administration is working more closely with the EU on matters relating to Turkey, the East Med, and the wider region. EU's approach with US support is if strictly maintained, could help offering Turkey incentives for meaningful cooperation, but also maintaining the threat of sanctions should Turkey revert back to aggression and confrontation. In its dire economic state, and it's getting worse as we talk, Turkey has much to gain by engaging constructively and cooperating with you, and much to lose if not. Essential to this is the escalation of tension in the East Med through continuation of the cessation of illegal drilling activities and continuation of bilateral talks between Greece and Turkey. In particular, Turkey must refrain from further unilateral actions in violation of international law. EEZ and continental shelf delimitation disputes should be addressed through dialogue under international law. And I'll probably say more about this later on during the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Charles. It was really useful to see your dose of realism there about what's really happening in the markets and what can really be done. And I especially liked your comment about doing a deal when it's possible to make a deal, because these opportunities do come and go. So thank you for that. And I will turn to our last speaker, to Ricardo, who is our Crisis Group's North Africa Project Director, and overseeing our work in Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, and Algeria, all countries which are literal countries to the Mediterranean Sea, and have now become involved in this East Mediterranean drama to greater or lesser extent. It'll be fascinating to hear what he has to say about that, bringing experience that he had before joining us in energy consultancies and policy consultancies. And so how real is the North African involvement in all the issues we've been discussing? Are they aware of the realities that Charles just outlined to us?
Thank you, Hugh. I think when we talk about the Eastern Mediterranean, inevitably we are talking about a very real, I would say, regional rivalry between Egypt and Turkey. Egypt has sort of emerged over the years as the main, almost antagonist or rival to Turkey's interests in relation to the development of the East Mediterranean gas resources, but not only, right? We know that Egypt and Turkey have obviously competed and are still competing over other geopolitical regional issues of great relevance to both countries, such as Libya, but obviously also the role of political Islam in the region. And Cairo has sort of, I would say, tried to position itself as an alternative, right, of offering an alternative vision on all of these issues, and particularly on the East Mediterranean. And in doing so, it has been supported by a growing group of regional allies, if we can call them that way. From the beginning, we could say that Egypt has really aimed to become the indispensable or unavoidable regional gas hub for the development of these resources. And one of the, I would say, key elements that it has tried to exploit was also its, what we can call its first mover advantage. Egypt was one of the first countries to develop and bring online its offshore natural gas resources. It has pre-existing gas infrastructure that it can use, obviously, in order to become a regional hub. And most importantly, it has diplomatic ties across the area that often, not always, of course, but often, I would say, cross regional cleavages. For example, Egypt obviously has permanent relations with Israel, among others. And in all of this, I would say Egypt has really emerged as the driving force behind the East Mediterranean gas forum. as we know. Which obviously, as Alyssa was saying already, it has been presented as a technical institution meant to handle the cross-border aspects of these resources and various other technical issues. But in reality, it has really become a geopolitically charged entity. And if we look, just a simple look at membership of this body is sufficient to understand this reality, right? We have Cyprus, Egypt, France, Greece, Jordan, Italy, as permanent members, but then we have Lebanon, Syria, and most importantly Turkey outside of these organizations. And one of the European countries that is obviously a member to this group is actually France, which is geographically hard to consider as belonging to the Eastern Mediterranean. So inevitably, I would say the growing tensions between Turkey on the one hand and many of the forum members on the other hand have really weighed heavily on this situation and on this group, of course. And over the past years, we have seen a kind of a consolidation of a loose coalition of Mediterranean states, more or less all driven by their opposition to Turkey's role and Turkey's interests in the region. And Egypt has really been at the forefront of this camp. It has really reinforced over the past few years its diplomatic and military ties with France, Greece, Cyprus, and the UAE, which is also, by the way, an observer to the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum. And this really, for example, has meant that, just to give an example, in May this year, Cairo bought 30 fighter jets Rafale from France, or that over the past months we have seen what almost appeared like an endless series of military drills in the Mediterranean in which these countries all took part, and that were all ostensibly, I would say, aimed against Turkey or possible clash with Ankara. So in all of this, obviously, there's been this, I would say, consolidation of interests or of an alliance almost against Turkey. And on the other hand, obviously, we've seen, as Berkay and Alyssa were already explaining, Ankara's reaction to this growing isolation. And one of the key, I would say, developments, and probably the key development in all of this, has been Turkey's direct military involvement in the Libyan conflict. That began between December 2019 and January 2020, as we know, officially on the invitation of the Tripoli government, which at the time was desperately fighting against Khalifa Haftar's forces that were on the outskirts of the Libyan capital, and they were about to topple the Tripoli government, which, by the way, was at the time the internationally recognized executive. So on the invitation of the Libyan government, Turkey began to send a vast amount of military supplies, its own troops, advisors, to halt this offensive, and most importantly, to preempt the defeat of the Western Libyan government. And this operation was extremely important because, on the one hand, obviously, it marked the spectacular reversal of the Libyan conflict, of the dynamics in the Libyan conflict. We went from an almost done victory for Haftar and its regional allies, so Egypt and the UAE, to an almost a defeat for them. But what is important, and is not just the dynamic inside the Libyan conflict, but also what came with this support. And maybe here we can bring up the slide that was shown before during Berkay's presentation on the delimitation of maritime borders, because Turkey here used this operation, so the support it brought to the Tripoli government, at the same time to strong arm the Tripoli government to accept a treaty that defined the international maritime border between Libya and Turkey. But this definition of the maritime border was suddenly in open contradiction with other agreements and other interpretations that the other Eastern Mediterranean countries had previously either signed or promoted. So this agreement really came as the price that the Tripoli government had to accept, had to pay for its own survival, for this intervention that really managed to avoid its own defeat. And we know from Libyan sources that the prime minister at the time, Serraj, was actually very reluctant to sign this deal, which, by the way, has not yet been ratified by the Libyan parliament. It was reluctant because it had inevitable domestic and regional ramifications. And at the same time, again, the overlapping of these two crises continued, because as Turkey continued to basically to back and support a counteroffensive inside Libya, this began to trigger alarm bells in Egypt. And it was in the summer of 2020 that many of us remember that President Sisi declared that the front line in central Libya, in the area of Sirte, was for Egypt a red line. If Turkey and the pro-Tripoli forces crossed that line, Cairo threatened to intervene directly inside Libya. So for several weeks, the risk of a direct clash, direct confrontation between Egypt and Turkey in Libya was quite of a real, I would say, risk. So we can now move on, and the showdown, as we know, never happened inside Libya, because the US and Germany in particular mediated between these two countries and convinced Ankara to halt its counteroffensive in central Libya. But what is very, I would say, fascinating right now, particularly with the benefit of hindsight, is that given all this history, given the tension and the rivalry between Egypt and Turkey, the situation in the Eastern Mediterranean, and then what happened in Libya, it is almost counterintuitive now to highlight that it's precisely that military intervention by Turkey that indirectly paved the way for a renewed push for negotiations at the beginning of the transition in Libya, on the one hand, but also the beginning of a gradual, even though it's yet still unfinished, reconciliation, potential reconciliation between Egypt and Turkey. So why am I saying this? Because Cairo and Ankara have began to talk right after the risk of a clash in Libya effectively subsided. Initially only at the military intelligence level, and initially only to focus on their divergences in Libya. But this sort of low-level dialogue between Egypt and Turkey was one of the factors that really enabled the beginning of the transition in Libya, the current transition that has been then brought forward by the UN. And from that dialogue, Turkey has actually taken the initiative of trying to resume a more formal and diplomatic conversation with Egypt. And Egypt, as we know, was actually reluctant at the beginning and wasn't really interested in that. But over the past months, we have seen Ankara trying to almost win over Egypt, but most importantly, trying to close this diplomatic gap between the two countries. And in May, there was a Turkish delegation led by the foreign minister visiting Cairo, which was obviously the first high-profile visit of this kind between the two countries. And now the two countries are talking about exchanging ambassadors again. Now, this is all obviously great and encouraging, but it's also important to highlight that there is still a series of outstanding issues that separates Turkey and Egypt. And most importantly, the issue of the presence in Turkey of several Egyptians affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood who are effectively in exile in Turkey, and Egypt wants them to try them. And then there is the issue, obviously, of Ankara's military presence in Libya, which is still unclear when it will end, when Turkey will decide to withdraw its forces from Libya. So I would say this is, there is a potential reconciliation here, which could have obviously, important repercussions for the situation in the Eastern Mediterranean. But Egypt, it's important to remember, Egypt is in no rush to normalize its ties with Turkey. From the Egyptian perspective, Cairo is in a position of strength. It wants first to extract concessions from Ankara before even considering Turkey's demands. And Turkey's demands obviously have not yet been fully articulated at this stage, but we know that they are related to the Eastern Mediterranean gas issue, the definition of the maritime border, where Egyptian officials have already signaled that they are willing to talk, to discuss with the Turks. And there's many people claiming that actually Turkish and Egyptian interests when it comes to the definition of the maritime border are not necessarily contradictory. There's actually a possibility for an arrangement, for a mutually beneficial arrangement at the same time. But at the same time, the Egyptians know very well that there is limited flexibility that they can offer on this issue because it has an impact on the other Eastern Mediterranean countries and states with which obviously Cairo has excellent relations that have been reinforced and strengthened over the years. So there is a certain willingness to find an arrangement, but there are also very clear, I would say, limitations and very, I would say, very difficult demands to meet for Turkey on the other hand. Obviously, again, this is obviously a positive development, from a regional perspective in terms of stability. But again, it's difficult to gauge at this moment how far this reconciliation can go. And it's, I think, important to remain cautious about its potential impact. It's something to encourage. It's something that has a positive repercussions, but it's also something that needs to be monitored carefully over time without falling into the trap of becoming overly enthusiastic about this. I'll stop here, Hugh, and so we can continue this conversation.
Thanks. It has been a fascinating hour hearing all these different perspectives put out so eloquently. We have a box on the YouTube channel for asking questions. Participants on Zoom obviously can also put questions to our distinguished guests and panelists there. And while you're thinking about what you may ask, because I'm not seeing that yet, I will just actually start by turning to Berkay with, it seems that sometimes listening to everybody that Turkey's at the center of it all, but at the same time supposedly isolated. The one moment no one wants to have anything to do with Turkey. At the other moment, it seems that all roads are leading to Ankara. How is the situation being read in Turkey? Is Ankara comfortable the way things are? Is it moving on to other partners? Does it think it's got everything balanced nicely? Is there more that it wants from a convergence with the EU? The negotiations to join the bloc seem to be completely frozen, but is there more that it can do in a transactional way? Could it just patch up with Egypt and go back to its old idea of being a regional leader? Or will it just continue in what one of its leaders used to call splendid isolation? How is Ankara reading the situation, Berkay?
Thank you, Hugh. Yeah, you're right. I think we are in a situation where, Ankara has realized that sort of it's deteriorated by bilateral relations with a number of countries are not serving its interest anymore. And that realization, of course, has prompted sort of new attempts to break out of that isolation. And, increasingly, we're also seeing this sense of, becoming more strategically autonomous. Strategic autonomy is coming up very often in the debates here in Turkey, but also sort of in general is expressed a lot by Turkish officials. That reflects on sort of the defense industry, but also, on steps elsewhere. So I think there is a sort of an attempt to do that. And of course, Turkey has historically always been balancing the West with Russia, and that's sort of one of the key points I think that we also need to look out for, because as Turkey's relations with the West deteriorated and Turkey found itself more, Russia actually increased its leverage on Turkey on a number of fronts. And that has made it more difficult for Turkey to balance ties with the West, obviously S-400s and all the other issues played into that. So I think right now we are sort of in a transition phase in Turkish foreign policy, where we are seeing both sort of a balancing and a sort of attempt to break out of this isolation and redefining Turkish foreign policy in a more strategically autonomous way. Not in the way that we saw potentially in the 90s, where Turkey would be a reliable NATO member, which again, I guess is part of the policy in general, but I think it goes a bit beyond that. Also, Turkey becoming more of an autonomous actor in foreign policy, trying to redefine and sort of let's say, delimit its area of operation in foreign policy, in foreign policy, mostly in ways that will serve its interests. So I think we have been seeing that sort of 3 or 4 things going in parallel. keeping the balance, but still redefining the limits that Turkey can push in terms of strategic autonomy. And I guess sort of the sense of, you know, a withdrawal, let's say, or lesser engagement of the US in this region has also played into that, because in the past Turkey would see sort of its alliance, would see more benefits from its you know, strong alliance with the US and within NATO, whereas recently that has shifted more, and you know, the US is not seen as a reliable actor, as less reliable, let's say, compared to the past. And I think that has also brought up the need to become more strategically autonomous and think about new ways of engaging with actors in the region.
Thanks, Berkay. Yes, strategic autonomy here. By the way, I don't think the 1990s we saw a Turkey that was obedient either. I mean, as it were, to the Western will. I remember constant clashes with the United States over NATO issues and so forth. But Yanis, if I could turn to you while everyone is thinking up their questions to our panelists, please don't be shy. They're eager to answer all that you may ask them. But Yanis, you've heard about the strategic autonomy. Where do you think Turkey fits in? How do you think everyone can get to a place where they are comfortable with each other? Is that a realistic prospect?
Well, I think what is really at stake here is to understand that when we talk about an autonomous actor, we're talking about an actor who is defining its policy according to a certain set of rules and norms. And this is the problem here for Turkey, I think. And maybe that's the issue that the Greek approach and what has been going on in the Eastern Mediterranean is been trying to put forward. The idea is that we need to have a relationship which is rules-based and not a purely cynical transactional relationship, whereby Turkey is trying to strike one-to-one deals with certain countries or trying to promote its interests in a realist point of view. The European Union doesn't operate or doesn't want to operate in that environment. So there is international law, there are international organizations that try to pave the ground for the resolution of international disputes. And this, I think, is one of the key questions. It's a preliminary question to answer before we enter into the discussion of resolving such issues. So in that respect, we can think of the resolution of the international disputes in the Eastern Mediterranean within a greater international legal framework. There are some legal instruments and there are some UN conventions on this. So I think that from the European Union or from the Greek point of view, it will be very important for Turkey to pledge that they will agree in principle that the international law is going to be the framework for the resolution of disputes. Of course, all countries have legitimate interests, and Turkey is one of them, but other countries have too. So finding the golden line that kind of reconciles our interests would be the most important point. Otherwise, that could be quite difficult, and it would be a relationship that has been recently developing in some ways. We can say, for example, that many critics in the European Union looked into the refugee deal between EU and Turkey as a very cynical transactional deal, whereby both sides were able to get something, but international norms suffered. And in light of this, of course, we cannot escape looking into the domestic situation in the country, where the rule of law in Turkey goes, or where freedoms go, because over the years, over the decades, that was one of the most important things to expect from the improvement of EU-Turkey relations, that democratization in Turkey would develop, and Turkey's ranking in freedoms or human rights international lists would improve. And it is an important discussion to have within the European Union, whether we've given up completely with this and we're trying to engage with Turkey on a different level, or whether we think that this is still something worth pursuing. And addressing some of the disputes between EU member states and Turkey, or the European Union as a whole and Turkey, would be very important in that respect.
So many moving parts. We have a question from Harvey Carroll Jr., who's asking about Libya as well, another piece of the puzzle to put in. And Ricardo, I guess this one is for you. He's asking really who's in charge. And I would just add to that, does the change that we've seen in Libya, you referred to Prime Minister Sarraj's reluctance to sign that very sort of almost historic deal, even if unratified, on the maritime delimitation with Turkey. Does the new government that's come in mean that Turkey's losing out there now? Is there a change? Do you think this is a seismic shift?
I think it's one of the real key features or issues in the current Libyan transition is exactly that. So which of the international and regional powers that are present and influential in Libya has more control or more influence over this government, and most importantly, what is Turkey's position in all of this, in the transition, and how do they see this obviously going forward? And it's, first of all, we have to go back to the genesis and the birth of this government. This government was a little bit of a surprise. It came out of a very complicated internal negotiation process with a very complex election procedure that eventually produced a government that was a surprise to everyone, was not really what Turkey or Egypt or the UAE were really trying to get as part of this negotiation process. But all these different regional powers eventually accepted this accepted this government, and they decided that it would work with it. And probably the fact that it was sufficiently, I would say, far from and protected from the influence of these various actors was one of the features that enabled it to be successful. But at the same time, obviously, this is not just what was happening in Libya. It's not just a matter of diplomatic influence. It's also a matter of military influence and military presence with boots on the ground inside the country. And as we know, Turkey is one of the countries, it's actually the only country that has an official, open presence in Libya, while Egypt and the UAE obviously have offered other types of assistance, and Russia has private military contractors and not official troops in this country. So Turkey is reluctant, as I said before, to remove its military presence from Libya. It wants this to happen in a manner that does not necessarily endanger its own interests in this country. And obviously, one of the key interests that Turkey is trying to protect in the new Libya is also this treaty, the maritime border definition agreement that has not yet been ratified by the Libyan parliament, which, by the way, is also unlikely ever to be ratified, at least by this parliament, because it's actually controlled by forces that are, I would say, antagonistic to Turkish interests. So it's clear here that one of the key drivers of the stalemate in Libya in the transition and the lack of clarity regarding the withdrawal of foreign forces and specifically of Turkish forces is also what will happen to Ankara's interests in Libya with the new government after the elections in December, and so on and so forth. And this is something that obviously will need to be clarified and I would say agreed on by Turkey with the other regional actors, and specifically Egypt. And that's where I think the Egypt-Turkey rapprochement comes into play and becomes extremely important, because once Cairo and Ankara are able to reach some sort of understanding about their respective interests and respective agendas in the region, then it will become easier for Libya to move on in its transition, for Turkey to withdraw its forces from the country, and also to clarify exactly the issue of the maritime borders, which remains obviously at the heart of all of this. So, as you can see, all these issues are extremely closely, I would say, related, and it's impossible to solve just one of them in isolation from the others. They all need to be tackled, I would say, together for the Libyan transition and the Eastern Mediterranean issues to be able to move forward.
Another call for dialogue from Crisis Group, but it's all interconnected, as you say, and very, very important that they all be dealt with at the same time. We have another question, though, from Lambros Sirmos, directed to Yanis, which is in relation to the question of the mediation of Germany, which has been such a positive feature of events in Turkey in recent years, that Angela Merkel especially has proved to have such a constructive relationship with the Turkish president. But on the other hand, Greeks have felt left down, and I think Lambros Sirmos is one of them. Where do you think this has left Greek-German relations, and is that a problem going forward, Yanis?
Well, I need to highlight here that German-Greek relations, they suffered a lot over the last decade. So anti-German feeling came to replace anti-American feeling that was quite dominant in Greece for many, many decades. And of course, this was linked to the financial crisis and the perceived role of Germany in that respect. I would like to highlight that there were some opinion leaders and a significant part of the Greek public opinion that were thinking that Germany prioritized its own economic relations with Turkey over defending European norms or even Greek interests in that respect when it came to the Greek-Turkish disputes over the Eastern Mediterranean, over the migration crisis, and so on and so forth. And interestingly, that was one of the criticisms that the German government received within its borders too. So I think the Green Party was also very upset about the fact that Germany could strike deals with the Turkish government regardless of the state of affairs of the human rights within Turkey or other important domestic issues. I would like to highlight though here that for most European experts, and I would agree on that, I would see the two positions of France and Germany as complementary and not as contradicting each other. So in that respect, France would take a stronger position in defending Greece and Cyprus, and would even send military forces there. But Germany would keep a dialogue of communication open with Turkey and capitalize on this very important personal relationship that you mentioned, which I, in the beginning of my presentation, argued it was missing between the leaders of Greece and Turkey. So in that respect, I would see that all this worked together. And very importantly, there was a meeting of the South European leaders in Corsica, in whose communique the leaders recognized German diplomatic efforts for de-escalation. So I would prefer to see this as a part of a continuum and a part of the whole picture, and not as two countries, the two leading countries of the European Union, trying to compete against each other and leaving Greece either an expectation of more support or leaving Greece disappointed because it doesn't get the support it expected.
Thank you. Yes, very important, these contacts. And while we're waiting for another question from the chat, the Q&A or on the YouTube channel, I'd like to just ask Charles Elinas about something which another aspect of the realism. One of the most surprising projects to have emerged from the early 2011 enthusiasms, 2012, was that a giant pipeline that was going to come from the far east of the Mediterranean to Europe. It's still, I think, officially part of European policy to support this pipeline. Is that really still on the cards? Is that anything that anybody really thinks will ever be built?
Not really. I mean, the East Med gas pipeline has always been a political tool. I mean, it's Israel has been trying to get access to, or access, try to increase its influence in Europe, has been trying to find ways to get its gas exported, came up with this idea, but it never was commercially viable. The pipeline not only is technically very challenging, but to get the gas to Europe, it will take a price of about $8 per million BTU to make it commercially viable. Longer-term prices in Europe are low, much lower than that. Russian gas can be sold to Europe at $4, either as by pipeline or Novatek as LNG, at $4 and still be profitable. This pipeline cannot compete. And now, with the shift in Europe towards clean energy away from gas, and the expectation that by the end of this decade, gas consumption in Europe will go down, and beyond that, go down even more, it doesn't justify this pipeline. It's not likely to happen. So it continues to be part of the projects of common interest in terms of the EU having already approved it, continues to fund studies on the pipeline. But the challenge is to attract first of all, to find buyers for the gas in Europe, because without buyers for the gas in Europe, it cannot happen. And then attract the investment required, which will be $8 to $10 billion. Where is that going to come from? The EU is not going to build the pipeline, and neither is the US. So who is going to put the money? I mean, after all these years, this pipeline idea has been in existence for 10 years. If it was such a hot thing, why the oil companies operating in the region, why didn't they jump onto the bandwagon and invested in the pipeline and make it happen? After all, they will benefit by exporting their gas to Europe. The reason they haven't shown any interest is because it's not commercially viable. It's as simple as that. So politically, it's a good thing to pursue, and it has indirect benefits. It brought Israel, Cyprus, and Greece together into an alliance around the pipeline. It attracted huge political interest, huge support from Europe and the United States. But that's all political. Politics alone don't make pipelines happen.
That's a fascinating insight. Thanks, Charles. Yes, it's amazing how these projects take on virtual lives of their own. We have no further questions from the floor, but I think I would like to turn to Alyssa just to wrap up all that we've discussed. You talked to Alyssa of some skepticism in the EU about how long this relative lull and positive direction in the East Mediterranean could last, but you've also talked about a convergence in the EU, and we've heard from Ricardo that there's a sense that France and Germany sorry, Yanis, that France and Germany are in some respects playing two parts from the same score. Do you think that there's a will in the European Union to at least sort out a joint position, that there are things it could do, and if so, what would those things be that you think that they should do? Is the East Mediterranean Forum something? Is there something else that Europe can do to keep the current lack of tension going on for longer?
Thanks, Hugh. I'm not sure I can wrap up everything we've discussed, but I can certainly try to draw some points from this very rich discussion. In terms of, I mean, the good cop, bad cop, Germany, France, I don't know if that was intentional, but certainly that's the way, in a larger sense, the EU policy has been formed of carrot and stick with respect to Turkey. I think now, where with the tensions starting early last year, especially over Cyprus, and then sort of expanding with the crisis with Greece over the summer, there was a lot more debate and all of these different interests that I talked about, fears over migration, fears about losing a strategic ally within NATO, these different sort of considerations that different EU member states rank in different ways when it comes to Turkey. But certainly this idea of a phased, proportionate, and reversible kind of approach to Turkey, it has been reaffirmed in the last European Council. I think, part of the problem is how the EU can deliver on that, because a lot of the aspects don't have to do with anything we really talked about during this last hour. They have to do with, economic reforms in Turkey. They have to do with different aspects of the way that the EU structures those sort of like customs union reform is based on a whole bunch of things that don't have to do with our discussion about geopolitics or about ships in contested waters. So that's a difficulty going forward. But I think, and some might disagree, that it's useful to at least compartmentalize the sort of interest-based cooperation and the values-based criticism to try to maintain, a working relationship with Turkey. And then I think another thing that's interesting is, what Charles was just speaking about, this East Med gas pipeline. It's political. It's, there are these different, and that's just an example, but of these sort of flashpoints, if you were, and some of them are in unnecessary or not backed up by the economics or by the reality behind it. And I think it would be useful for, especially with transatlantic cooperation, to kind of put these things back into perspective and, say, more clearly, the US and the EU could say more clearly, despite the fact that this has been a source of cooperation for Israel, Greece, and Cyprus, to also acknowledge that maybe this is not, there are other alternatives or better alternatives to, the longest, deepest pipeline in the world to get gas from the region to Europe, and that, that you should sort of explore some of those things. Also, maybe exploring the idea of including Turkey in some of these groups like the East Med Gas Forum. We talked about all the reasons why that's, extremely difficult. But, I think working towards that goal, of Turkey becoming an observer, maybe with some kind of conditional membership in the longer term, would be a way to reduce tensions. But I mean, of course, as we said, there's some skepticism, and at least from the EU perspective, when talking about Turkey, you have sort of a spectrum of what concrete steps different EU member states would like to see for, proof that that Turkey is going to be a more constructive partner, I guess, and that goes all the way to, withdrawing troops from Libya. So then you get back into this knot of regional issues that are very different from just, these very specific EU-Turkish relationships. I don't know if that brings in some of the aspects we talked about.
It does indeed. Thank you, Alyssa. And we have one question we have just time for from Jochen de Hoop. The question is, how would the pushbacks in the Aegean Sea fit into the dispute between Turkey and Greece? That's the pushbacks of refugees who are trying to reach Greek islands mostly, but sometimes over the rivers in Thrace, and they are being pushed back. How is that affecting the Turkey-Greece things? Berkay, can I ask you to have a go at that?
Yes, sure. I mean, we've seen some tensions also recently between coast guards of the two countries in the seas. Of course, right now, so there's a diplomatic sort of, diplomacy is sort of in the forefront in Turkey and Greece. So when times are more conducive to talking, then it's easier to sort of dismiss these smaller scale incidents and go past them. And we've seen that, before that there were in dogfights when a fighter jet was downed, because politicians were quite openly sort of not making a big issue around that. It didn't turn into a big issue. But of course, these small incidents also at times when, there was, when the situation was more fragile, also turned into a bigger escalation, or were at least the precursors of more steps towards escalation. So I think it's important to watch that and to be mindful of sort of how this cooperation that the EU is designing right now on migration, how that is going to be reframed to also reduce sort of the risks of more people crossing through the Aegean. And I guess that's, what role will Frontex assume in that sense, and what roles will the coast guards of the two countries be asked to assume on that front. So I think, I don't see it as a sort of big flashpoint that could push the sides towards something more dangerous right now, at least. But I think it's still something that needs to be watched. And the recent escalation that happened, not escalation, but the clash between two coast guards a month ago, I think was testimony for the fact that this is sort of an issue that needs to be closely watched.
Thanks, Yanis. Very briefly, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, let me add to this the negative effect of the pandemic. Due to the pandemic, low-level contacts and civil society contacts have come to zero, especially on the coast, on the Eastern Aegean islands and the Western Turkish coast. So this has had a negative effect on cooperation communication that may have contributed to such incidents. So hopefully with a recession of the pandemic, we'll be able to recover this contacts and improve collaboration on sensitive issues like the migration question.
Thank you very much, and thank you everybody, and thank you, Alyssa, for wrapping things up on the high scale as well. I have to say I'm encouraged slightly by the tone of the discussion. We talked about tensions in the title of this session, but there's actually been more about politics and possibilities for improvements ahead. So I hope we can hold this moment and foster it. And I thank you, Berkay, Charles, Yanis, and Alyssa very much for your interventions. And I will say goodbye to our audience as well. Thank you for listening in. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.